For the past 60 years or so, we've been hearing a series of very specific, time-bound warnings about environmental collapse. Well, the deadlines for these predictions have now come and gone. So today, we're going to do something a little different. We're conducting a forensic audit of the evidence, looking at what was predicted, what actually happened, and maybe most importantly, why. So let's dig in.
So what you're looking at here, this timeline, it's really a map of deadlines. And it highlights a key concept from our source material, something called catastrophic determinism. That's the idea of treating the absolute worst-case scenario as a future that's already locked in. In this explainer, we're going to investigate why so many of these dire forecasts just didn't happen by their appointed date.
And here it is, the big picture result of our audit. You can see across these four major categories of prediction, the real-world data shows this incredibly consistent pattern of failure. Now, let's be crystal clear about something. This is not a critique of the underlying physics of our climate or our environment. Not at all. It's an investigation into a very specific habit, the way complex possibilities get turned into simple and, as it turns out, incorrect certainties.
Okay, so before we can really open the case files, we have to lock in one absolutely crucial concept. Honestly, it's the key to this whole story. We have to understand the difference between a scientific projection and a public prediction. They sound similar, but they are worlds apart.
Now this slide, I think, lays out what our source calls the architecture of error just perfectly. Look on the left. That's a scientific projection. It's all about if-then statements. It says, if we follow this high emissions path, then there is a risk of this outcome. See? It's a map of possibilities. But on the right, you've got a public prediction. It's totally different. It's declarative. It doesn't say if. It just says the North Pole will be gone in 5 years. For our audit today, we are only looking at that second category, the specific, falsifiable predictions.
All right, so with that critical distinction between a projection and a prediction in our back pocket, it's time to open up the evidence files. And we're going to start with one of the most famous predictions of the entire 20th century. Our first file is what we'll call the Malthusian Mirage. And it really kicks off with Paul Ehrlich's hugely influential 1968 book, The Population Bomb. He didn't just warn of a potential problem. He made a very specific, time-bound claim. He said the battle was over and mass starvation was not just possible, but inevitable within the next decade.
And wow, this chart just lays out what happened next so clearly. That dotted red line, that's the predicted great die-off. But the solid blue line, well, that's reality. And that massive green wedge between them, that's the green revolution gap. The prediction was completely, utterly wrong because it failed to account for a massive leap in technology, the agricultural revolution led by Norman Borlaug, that basically blew up the whole equation.
And this wasn't just a one-off error. Others repeated it, predicting the whole non-Western world would be starving by the year 2000. They even called India a hopeless case. But what actually happened? The complete opposite. India became a food exporter, and the world embarked on the single greatest reduction of poverty in all of human history.
Okay, let's move to the next file, the new Ice Age scare from the 1970s. For a while there, a cooling trend led to some wild headlines and predictions, like one from an ecologist named Kenneth Watt, who said the world would be 11 degrees colder by 2000. The mistake here was taking a short-term trend caused by industrial aerosols and just assuming it would go on forever, totally missing the much bigger, more powerful warming effect from greenhouse gases that was just around the corner.
Our next file, the resource exhaustion fallacy, is all about a huge misunderstanding of what a resource even is. Influential groups predicted we'd just run out of stuff. Oil gone by 2000, metals gone by 1990. They saw resources as a fixed pile in the ground. What they didn't get is that reserves are actually a function of price and technology. When something gets scarce, the price goes up, which then fuels innovation, like the fracking revolution, which completely upended the predictions and turned the US into a top oil exporter.
Oh man, the cryosphere file. This one is packed with famous failed predictions. We heard repeatedly that the Arctic would be ice-free by dates like 2013 or 2016. Remember the signs in Glacier National Park that said the glaciers would all be gone by 2020? Yeah, they had to take those down. A climate scientist in the UK even famously said that kids just aren't going to know what snow is. In every single case, they mistook a downward trend for an unstoppable inevitability, underestimating natural cycles and stabilizing forces.
The whole sinking nations narrative followed a pretty similar script. Way back in 1988, a prediction was cited that the Maldives would be totally gone underwater by 2018. Well, that deadline passed, and not only is the nation still there, it's actually growing. This prediction missed a huge variable: human adaptation. The Maldives didn't just sit there and wait for the tide to come in, they engineered their way out of the problem, raising land and even building new islands.
And this might be one of the most striking examples of all. In 2005, a UN report predicted there'd be 50 million climate refugees by the year 2010. It was a massive, massive story. But then 2010 came and went, and that giant wave of refugees, it just never happened. In fact, census data showed that many of the places people were supposed to be fleeing from were actually growing in population. The UN eventually just quietly removed the map from its website.
So as you look back over all these different case files, from famine to ice caps to refugees, a very clear pattern starts to emerge. This evidence reveals a common anatomy of an error that helps explain why these expert predictions kept failing in such similar ways.
It really comes down to three key flaws. First, linear extrapolation. You take a short-term trend, like a bad year for Arctic ice melt, and just draw a straight line down to zero. Second, there's the business-as-usual fallacy. You completely ignore our ability to innovate and adapt, whether that's inventing new seeds or building better seawalls. And third is something called the hysteresis effect, which is basically a kind of tunnel vision where you get so attached to that scary worst-case curve on the graph that you start ignoring what's actually happening in the real world.
So, our audit is complete. We've reviewed the evidence files. What's the final verdict on this 60-year history of catastrophic predictions?
Of the roughly 150 specific, deadline-driven predictions of environmental collapse that we audited, the success rate, as of today, is a stark 0%.
So the huge takeaway from this whole audit isn't that there's no risk. It's that the nature of the risk has been consistently mischaracterized. As our source material puts it so well, the danger is a long-term complex challenge, a slow rising tide. And that kind of problem is just not well served by short-term dramatic deadlines that treat it like a sudden pounce. The wolf hasn't arrived because the danger was never a wolf to begin with.
And that leaves us with a really critical question for right now. Given this 6-decade history of crying wolf, how do we effectively communicate urgency and manage the very real, long-term environmental risks we do face without just repeating this exact same pattern of failed, deterministic predictions?